Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a case that I'm guessing you probably remember, at least vaguely, from the headlines way back when the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Erik Menendez.
And you've provided us with some really fascinating documents for this deep dive. Excerpts from a lengthy appeal, which is kind of perfect because it lets us go beyond just the true crime salacious aspect of it all and really dig into the legal arguments.
Exactly. So this isn't just about murder, it's about how the brothers' claims of self-defense played out in court. Okay, so for anyone who maybe needs a refresher or wasn't even born yet when this all went down, August 20th, 1989, picture a Beverly Hills mansion. You know, the epitome of wealth and privilege. But behind closed doors, something absolutely horrific has happened. Jose and Kitty Menendez are found shot to death.
And it's the sheer brutality of the crime scene that grabs everyone's attention right from the start. I mean, this wasn't just a random act of violence. The overkill, the way it was done, suggested something much more personal, much more calculated.
Right. And then enter their sons, Lyle and Erik, claiming they just stumbled upon this horrifying scene. They even made a 911 call.
Oh, yeah. Those calls, I mean, even listening to them now, you can hear the panic in their voices, the shock. And no one suspects them at this point.
Right. They're grieving sons. Or so everyone thinks.
And I think it's really important to remember how critical those early days were in shaping public perception. Lyle especially was very media savvy. He's giving interviews, offering theories about the mafia being involved, even crying on cue for the cameras.
Like something out of a movie almost.
Exactly. It was a performance, really, and for a while it seemed like it might actually work.
But then, of course, the investigation takes that turn. Turns out they bought shotguns. Days before the murders. They even practiced using them.
Yeah, not exactly your typical grieving son behavior, is it?
Not at all.
And it's that premeditation that really comes back to haunt them later on when they're trying to build this self-defense case. Because remember, for a successful self-defense plea, your actions have to be justifiable in the moment, right? Not part of some carefully thought out plan.
Exactly. And the more investigators dig, the more holes they find. Discarded movie tickets, a last-minute change of plans.
All pointing to a carefully constructed alibi that's rapidly fallen apart.
Right. It's like they were building their defense before even committing the crime.
Trying to control the narrative from the get-go. And then we get to the confession, which is really where things take this fascinating turn.
Because it's not just any confession. They confessed not to the police, but to their therapist, Dr. Oziel.
Dr. Oziel, yeah, that name becomes synonymous with this whole case.
Totally.
Because this wasn't just a private confession between a therapist and his clients. Dr. Oziel, concerned about his own liability, starts recording their sessions, specifically one from December 11th. And that tape, let me tell you, that becomes a total game changer for the prosecution.
You talk about a rock and a hard place for a therapist to be in.
Yeah.
You're bound by confidentiality, but then your clients confess to a double homicide. I mean, that's a whole other level of ethical dilemma.
It really is. And it brings up all these questions about the boundaries of doctor-patient confidentiality that honestly are still being debated even today. And you have to remember, this was the late 80s. Public awareness around therapy was quite different then.
It wasn't as common. Definitely not as accepted as it is now.
Yeah.
So to have these tapes suddenly thrust into the spotlight, it was huge because they weren't just evidence. They offered this raw, unfiltered window into the brothers' minds, their state of mind, their rationale, if you can even call it that, for the murders.
Absolutely. And what's striking is, in these takes, they talk about, eliminating the problem, about the murders being this necessary evil, not exactly the language of terrified individuals acting in self-defense.
Definitely not. It's cold, calculated, and it paints a much, much darker picture than the one they presented to the public initially.
100%. And that's really where the case gets interesting, at least from our perspective, from the legal standpoint, because now it's not just about whether they did it. I mean, they practically admitted to that, but why? What was going through their minds? And could they convince a jury that those reasons, whatever they might be, justified taking 2 lives?
And that's where the whole concept of imperfect self-defense comes into play. Right?
Yes. Which, as we're going to unpack further, is a very, very nuanced and often misunderstood legal argument.
Okay, so imperfect self-defense. It's not exactly a term you hear every day. What does it actually mean, especially in the context of this case?
So basically it means the brothers are arguing they truly believe their lives were in danger. Even if to an outsider, to a reasonable person, that belief seems, I don't know, maybe a little skewed. It all hinges on this idea of imminent peril, Did they genuinely believe in that moment that they were in immediate, serious, life-threatening danger?
So it's not just about whether the threat was real, but about how they perceived that threat.
Right, exactly. It gets tricky, legally speaking, because how do you prove what's going on inside someone's head? How do you measure fear objectively and then say, okay, yeah, that level of fear justifies taking a life?
It's all very subjective, isn't it? Open to interpretation.
And that is exactly what makes the Menendez case so fascinating, because the defense isn't just arguing about the act of the murders themselves, but about everything leading up to that night, the years of alleged abuse.
Right. The brothers are claiming they were victims, physical abuse, psychological abuse, even sexual abuse at the hands of their parents. And Erik, he even takes the stand and gives this incredibly emotional, very detailed testimony about it.
And that right there is a calculated risk by the defense. Because by putting Erik on the stand, they're aiming to humanize the brothers, make the jury relate to them, empathize with them, see them as victims themselves.
Because if the jury believes they were trapped in this cycle of abuse, well, their actions, even extreme actions, might start to make more sense, even if it doesn't perfectly align with, a clear-cut case of self-defense.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, even if you accept that abuse happened, does that give you the right to take a life? The prosecution's argument was a resounding no. They argued this wasn't about fear, it was about greed, about seeing a way to inherit a fortune and taking it.
And to really hammer that point home, the prosecution brings out those tapes, the ones from Dr. Oziel, those chilling recordings where the brothers talk about eliminating the problem in their own words. It's hard to maintain that image of them as these scared, vulnerable victims when you hear that.
Oh, absolutely. Those tapes were a turning point in the trial. I mean, how do you come back from that? It's their own voices, their own words.
It makes you think about the power of language, especially in a courtroom. How much weight should be given to a defendant's account of events when it might be contradicted by things they've said before?
100%. It's a classic example of these conflicting narratives. And ultimately, it was up to the jury to decide who to believe. But it wasn't just about what the brothers said, right? The court also had to decide what evidence to allow in the first place.
Because you can't just make accusations in court, right? You need proof.
Exactly. The defense wanted to bring in witnesses to back up these abuse claims, people to corroborate what the brothers were saying. But there's this catch-22.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Because if they did that without having Lyle testify himself, well, it could be seen as violating his right to confront his accusers.
So they need the evidence to support their case, but getting that evidence might compromise their entire legal strategy.
Exactly. And that's where, when you look at the actual court documents you provided, the legal arguments get super interesting. You see the prosecution arguing that allowing certain evidence would be prejudicial, that it would sway the jury based on emotion rather than, the cold, hard facts.
It's a tightrope walk, isn't it? Trying to present this compelling defense without crossing the line into something that's just not admissible in court.
Exactly. And the prosecution, meanwhile, is looking for any opportunity to dismantle that defense. To now, even if you accept some parts of their story, it still doesn't add up to justifiable homicide.
And it's especially interesting given Lyle's claim that, basically, the prosecution used the absence of certain evidence against him in their closing arguments.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really important point, because he's essentially saying, look, you, the prosecution, you prevented us from presenting this full picture of the abuse, right? And then you turned around and used that very lack of evidence to your advantage.
So it becomes this question of fairness in the courtroom. Can you, as a prosecutor, benefit from the very evidence that you work to exclude?
It's a really fascinating debate, and one that I don't think is fully settled even today in legal circles. But regardless of where you stand on that issue, ultimately the jury in the Menendez trial, they heard the arguments, they weighed the evidence that was presented, and they reached a verdict.
And that verdict, after a retrial, after months of this just insane scrutiny, was guilty. First-degree murder for both Lyle and Erik Menendez. Life sentences without the possibility of parole.
It's a case that just stays with you even all these years later.
It really does.
Because it forces you to confront all these uncomfortable questions about, about family dynamics, about the dark side of wealth and privilege, and about the limits of self-defense, especially when you're dealing with these allegations of abuse.
Yeah, it challenges our perceptions. Makes you wonder, can we ever really know what goes on behind closed doors?
Yes.
Within families?
Absolutely. And I think, from a purely legal perspective, it really highlights the complexities of this idea of imperfect self-defense, the challenges of trying to prove something as subjective as a person's state of mind. and where we draw that line between what's justifiable and what's just straight up premeditated murder.
So after this deep dive, after really combing through these documents, what are we left with? Because it's not just some, sensationalized true crime story, right? It's a case that forces us to sit with some really big, really uncomfortable questions.
Right. And it reminds us that the law it isn't always black and white. There are gray areas, conflicting narratives, subjective interpretations of events.
And sometimes, even with mountains of evidence, hours of testimony, the truth, it remains elusive.
It really does.
The Menendez case, it's this stark reminder that justice, as much as we strive for it, is often messy, imperfect.
Yeah. And I think it also makes you think about the ripple effects of a case this big, this public. Did it set a precedent for how we view cases involving these claims of imperfect self-defense? Did it change how we as a society think about abuse? I don't know.
Those are really good questions.
Yeah.
And I think they go a long way towards explaining why this case, why the Menendez brothers, why their story still captivates us even today.
It's a story that sticks with you.
And it's one that, hopefully, makes us examine our own perceptions of justice, of family, of the capacity for both good and evil that exists in us all. So on that note, until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.